Hi everyone, my name is Isha Hans. Welcome to my semester and thesis presentation. The title of my thesis is Penumbra of Privacy, Alternative Approaches to Privacy for IoT. The word penumbra is derived from a phenomenon of light. When the light falls on an object, it forms dark shadow called the umbra and a surrounding lighter shadow called the penumbra. This word has become a metaphor to place an emphasis on concepts that are ambiguous. With respect to privacy, in 1916, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas said that the specific guarantees in the Bill of Rights have penumbras. That is, the right to privacy, even if not explicit, was implicit in other rights. I'm drawing inspiration from this to explore the penumbra of privacy and go beyond the status quo of current practices. So let me first ask you this. When or where do you feel the greatest sense of privacy? Pause the video here for a minute, just think about it, and then play. Most of the answers I've heard make it very clear that most people care about some version of privacy. These answers usually refer to the idea of not being intruded, not being observed, or even just wanting to be let alone. Irvin Altman, a social theorist, had concluded that privacy is not a more or less static condition, but a dynamic process of having control over what one wants to share with selected others and what not. This was the idea of privacy in the physical realm. However, it's much more complicated in the digital realm. Let me talk you through it. The first thing to know about privacy in digital era is the idea of notice and choice. You've certainly come across some version of it on the websites, wherein a notice gives you an overview of what information is collected about you and how it will be used. This is usually complemented by accept or reject buttons, which is called collecting your consent or choice. Think about your own experience. Have you ever read any of this? And does it actually give you much control over your privacy on the internet? The simple answer is no. This practice is inadequate. The second is the idea of aggregation, which means multiple kinds of data collected about you can be combined to paint a holistic picture, including who you are, what you do, where you live, and also what you might like in the future. The third is that there are always some trade-offs. Attached with privacy risks are the benefits of digital technology. For example, sometimes having access to a service can be more enriching for an individual's life than the privacy risk associated with it. However, the last decade has revealed that this balance is not quite appropriate for much of our digital technology today. These practices have formed penumbra of privacy discourse in the digital era. The premise of my thesis is that despite proving to be inadequate, most of these have set the status quo for all emerging technology to follow in its footsteps. The Internet of Things and its applications for making buildings smarter are no exception to this. IoT is becoming the new hot tech trend that aggregates data such that our buildings, urban spaces, and even whole cities are moving towards a new form of surveillance through it. Why is this important, you ask? Because IoT is more than sensors. It weaves in digital systems into the everyday fabric of our lives, such that people and technology become enmeshed. Yet, the current narratives do not approach this from a human-centered or a place-centered perspective. We've started looking at buildings merely as computers, and we are forgetting to account for human values. These values and sociocultural dimensions are entangled with the use of spaces, and hence the very notion of privacy itself. I argue that we must talk about computing and human side of things together instead of the current dominant narrative of technology first. We need broader approaches by looking at the penumbra. A theory of change is needed for how might we embed privacy values into the very design of IoT that accounts for the lived experience of people in these physical spaces. I do realize that this is a lofty goal. So I'm first starting by investigating what values and social cultural norms must we talk about for privacy. Hence, the very specific research question that I have is, in looking at privacy from a socio-technical perspective, what values and principles must be embedded in the design of IoT for non-domestic spaces to ensure a people-centered privacy perspective? Let me walk you through it one by one. When I say the word privacy, I do not mean secrecy, but rather appropriate flow of information. In order to identify the values that I'm referring to, I'm using value-sensitive design framework by Bhatia Friedman et al., who are HCI scholars. According to this framework, conceptual and empirical investigations must be used to inform the technical design and development of technology. I use the word people-centered because it captures the messiness of human life. lastly, I believe that contextuality is important and it impacts the nature of human relationships and behaviors. Hence, I'm looking at the non-domestic realm. I'm using a project as a case study called MDes.io, which is housed in a co-working building at CMU Pittsburgh campus. MDes is an IoT project with broadly defined scope as future applications for smart buildings. The interior of the building is equipped with sensors in every space except the washroom. This one board you see here, which says the sensor, is actually a collection of 12 different kinds of sensors. If you visit the building, you'll find these letter-sized printouts of notice about what data is collected, about what sensors exist in the building, without clarifying the nuances of how this data will be used and aggregated. Yet, this is used as the first argument of a privacy-preserving perspective. The QR code in the notice leads you to a 20-page FAQ document that includes questions about how data will be secured and how certain groups of occupants might be able to not participate by writing an email to the researchers. The absolute lack of questions about why this is being done repeats the narrative of let's collect all the data we want and we'll see later what we want to do with it. It also lacks a people-centered perspective as it did not engage the occupants through a participatory process during its vision. Out of all the groups that sit at this building, perhaps the most interesting is Masters of Privacy Engineering students. They make a perfect audience for my study as they are training to be future privacy experts and are simultaneously the occupants implicated by this technology. They work, laugh, rest, share, and sometimes even dance in this space in celebration of finishing an assignment. So let me tell you about my process. It included a patchwork ethnography followed by interviews, synthesis, and a workshop. I'll be conducting the workshop in Jan 2022 by using the synthesis for a co-design exercise. Let me tell you about the ethnography first. The ethnography helped me observe privacy-protecting behaviors of individuals in public areas of the building. For example, I observed that the visitors had a strong tendency to sit with their back towards the main entrance, even though it made their laptop screen more visible to a passerby. This informed early ideas for the interviews. I designed interviews to start with open-ended questions about participants' general notions of privacy before moving on to more specific ones. This did consume the first 10 to 12 minutes of the interview, but I made this choice in order to set the tone of this interview to not be purely technical. This was followed by questions about MDes and a design probe on Miro. At times, I also made sure to clarify if their answer was based on their position as an occupant or as a privacy expert. Lastly, I used grounded research methodology to identify key insights and then synthesize them to arrive at the values. I had a couple of insights, but I'm doing 4 more interviews in a few days and would be sharing only the early insights today. The first one is that the privacy risks definitely outweigh the current benefits. Based on my positionality of finding a balance between new innovation and its potential consequences, I had asked my participants to first list the benefits, privacy risks, and opportunities through rose, thorn, bud exercise. They then prioritized these on a spectrum from most important to consider to least important while talking me through their thought process. I did this to understand the trade-offs that they would be willing to make. Not only did they write more risks than the benefits, but also saw them as more crucial than the benefits of MDes. The second is engineers as end users. This group of audience has a sound technical knowledge as compared to an average individual, yet all of them questioned the purpose of the project and explicitly mentioned their discomfort with the sensors. Being in the shoes of the end users gives them the distance from their identity as engineers and offers a more empathetic perspective. One of the participants said, "As engineers, to learn what it feels like to deal with these technologies, I think we should be willing to actively sacrifice some of our own privacy because one day we'll be in a position of privilege where we'll be building these devices that other people don't understand." The third is the idea of anonymity in a crowd. In my questions around general notions of privacy, I had asked my participants about how they protect their privacy around roommate, friends, family members, classmates, in public areas of TCS, and in public spaces in general. 75% of these participants mentioned the idea of anonymity in public spaces. One of them said, "In Manhattan, hiding in the crowd made it easier to share sensitive information, even though I was aware that there are cameras everywhere. I'm more comfortable taking sensitive calls on Forbes Avenue during the workday than at TCS building." This idea of finding comfortable level of anonymity highlights the relationship between space and privacy itself. In the context of this co-working space, most people prefer to not talk about sensitive topics in the relatively private areas like the classroom and go out to take such calls. This highlights an interesting tension with the current way of thinking about privacy, wherein it's just assumed that individuals should expect least amount of privacy in the public realm and the most in the private realm. It's important to note that this mental model is based on the distinction between public and the domestic realm itself, but it may need a very different interpretation in the context of spaces like this co-working space, which are neither fully private nor fully public, but they have areas that fit both these definitions of public and private with respect to each other. Lastly, I used my insights to do an early synthesis of the values that emerged. There are 4 broad categories that I have identified. First, data practice, then decision-making, third, socio-technical, and fourth, spatial norms. There are multiple of them under each category. So far, I'm at 14 or 15. Some of the interesting ones include differentiation. That is, there must be a differentiation in what data is collected in different spaces instead of a blanket approach across all spaces of a building. For example, what data should be collected in corridors versus private spaces? This must be based on the context as well as creating foresight during the process of designing an IoT system. For decision-making, occupants of the building must be engaged through a participatory process. And the exact purpose of the data must be clear to an occupant even if they don't have technical knowledge. As my next steps, I'll first make these values concrete, and then whatever I learn in the next 4 interviews along with this will inform the creation of value scenarios. I will use these value scenarios to bring the same participants together for a co-design exercise. The eventual goal that I have is to propose guidelines for privacy for IoT-enabled co-working spaces. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to hearing your thoughts soon.